Fellow of the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. James Gesualdi is the Professor of Law at Hofstra Law School. And participating via Skype is Ron Kagan, the Executive Director and CEO of the Detroit Zoo. Handouts are available. Hopefully you all got them with the speakers' full bios. There's also a lot of information on the table outside, so you can take a look after the program. So the goals of the program are to really explore how zoos operate today and ways in which they arguably work well or arguably don't, and explore how zoos might work in the future. Given the time constraints, we're only going to really talk about well-established, accredited zoos that we're generally familiar with, not what are called roadside zoos, which are establishments that are often located off a highway exit, for example, and are often known for animal abuses and really serve little educational and conservation benefits. So we're talking about zoos that are large and pretty well known. The panelists will elaborate on accreditation standards as well as the enforcement of laws and guidelines applicable to zoos. To set a little baseline here in that regard, there's generally two major federal laws applicable to the keeping of animals in zoos. One is the Animal Welfare Act, and the other is the Endangered Species Act. The Animal Welfare Act sets minimum standards for the care, housing, handling, and transport of animals in zoos, but it's pretty limited. The standards are very basic. Cold-blooded animals are completely exempt from it, for example, and except for primates, animals' mental health is largely ignored. So the Animal Welfare Act has its limitations, as does the Endangered Species Act. That only applies to animals that are listed as threatened or endangered. And those animals cannot be harmed or harassed, but there are exemptions to those terms as well, some of which may apply to the practices that happen in zoos. So the panelists will get into this discussion and many others. They have about 15 minutes each for their introductions, and then we'll have a 30-minute Q&A with our moderator, Mikki Golar. She's also a member of the Animal Law Committee and former chair of the committee. And then we'll have about 15 minutes for audience Q&A. And we recognize that people are very passionate about animal welfare in this audience and zoos, and we just request that we have a very respectful and thoughtful discussion. So thank you very much for joining, and I'll kick it off to Dale Jamieson to start the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to say at the beginning that I first spoke actually at a conference put on in this building by the Animal Law Committee of the New York Bar Association back in the 1990s. And this was a wonderful occasion in which I met some people who have since become very close to me. And I look forward to tonight and also meeting some new people here as well. Now, my job is really to provide a kind of overview to the issues that we'll be discussing tonight. And I have to say the overview will be a somewhat opinionated overview, but nevertheless I hope it will be a fair-minded overview and introduction to the issues that we'll be discussing. So the first point that I want to make may sound obvious, but I think it's important, and that is that zoos have a history and a sociology. That zoos exist is not simply a natural fact that we should accept as some permanent part of the architecture of the world. In fact, from a certain point of view, zoos are kind of weird institutions, and I think to even begin to think about them, we need to recover some of that sense of strangeness about them. Zoos really began as royal menageries meant to symbolize the power of rulers. And then in the early 19th century, they developed as cultural institutions that were primarily focused on entertainment, and then later on education. And it's really only been relatively recently in the history of zoos that conservation has been regarded as their primary function. And what this really reflects is that through the centuries, our conceptions of animals and their value has continued to change and to shift. And zoos, like most institutions, embrace shifting rationales in order to maintain themselves during periods of societal change. Now, this is not an objection to zoos. This is just to point out that zoos are significant and in some cases reasonably powerful institutions, and like all institutions, find new cultural justifications as a strategy of self-maintenance. I mean, so in that sense, zoos can be thought of as being like football teams or symphonies. They're first and foremost cultural institutions, whatever else they may be. And just like professional sports teams, they're also, at least in the United States, regarded as marks of a city's identity and its importance. Like other cultural institutions, patterns of ownership and management also change through time and can also have an important effect on what happens in these institutions. And so I think it's important to kind of look at these ownership patterns in a way that I think we are often relatively visible, in fact, often not very clearly marked on the websites of zoos. Most zoos are owned by cities, although they're increasingly managed by nonprofit foundations. For example, the New York Parks and Recreation Department owns the aquarium and the 4 zoos in the city of New York, throughout the city. They are administered and managed by the Wildlife Conservation Society, but they are actually owned by the city. The city of Los Angeles, a zoo that, as some of you may know, has a relatively troubled recent history, the Los Angeles Zoo is actually owned by the city of Los Angeles, including all of its land and facilities and the animals. Animal care, grounds maintenance, construction, education, public information, and administrative staff are all city employees. So in the case of the Los Angeles Zoo, this is not mediated by a nonprofit institution like the Wildlife Conservation Society that manages and administers. The LA Zoo's model is really the older model of zoo management. And so I think there's a lot to be said just about those kinds of structures and the effects that they have on what happens in the zoos. But when we think about zoos then, we can think of them really from 3 different perspectives. And I'm going to go through all 3 of these perspectives, but I'm going to spend most of the time on the first perspective and then sort of close on kind of a whimper by the time I get to the third perspective, right? So the first perspective is really to think about zoos as a national or global system and really ask the question whether it would be better if they didn't exist. The second perspective is to compare individual zoos and ask questions about individual zoos. For example, you can ask whether AZA accredited zoos are better than other kinds of zoos. You can ask whether the Detroit Zoo is better than the Los Angeles Zoo, of which Ron would be happy to know the clear answer is yes. And in fact, there is a great deal of variation among zoos, and it's important to be cognizant of that. At the third level, we can ask about various exhibits within individual zoos. All zoos have exhibits that are better and worse than other exhibits. And when looking at these questions from that perspective, we can ask, for example, are there certain kinds of animals that simply cannot be kept in our current zoo system? And many zoos, for example, Ron Zoo, have come to the conclusion that in fact elephants cannot be kept in a way that without compromising their welfare in our current zoo system. And I think this is an answer that some zoos will increasingly come to with respect to other animals as well. Okay, so first I want to say some things then about this whole system of zoos, which we've really inherited, and ask really large questions about the justification of this system and about whether in some sense it would have been better had things not happened this way. So the first question then is, why have zoos? And the classic arguments in favor of zoos are that they provide opportunities for entertainment, education, research, and conservation. And I think it's important to recognize that entertainment really, I think, continues to be the most fundamental and important function of zoos in the sense of really motivating why people go to zoos. But it's also one that increasingly is not acknowledged as explicitly as it once was, and not defended as explicitly as it once was. And I think that's because the idea that zoos are fundamentally about entertainment doesn't really set very well in a world in which animals are increasingly valued and respected. Entertainment as the function of zoos really does conjure up the early zoos and menageries and these existing roadside zoos that have already been alluded to, which were and indeed continue to be uncomfortably close to circuses and freak shows. And once we go there, it also begins to conjure up the image of Oda Benge, who some of you may know was an African pygmy man who lived in the Central Park Zoo. Really is a kind of living exhibit. And Oda Benge reminds us of how close, in fact, this purported link can be between entertainment and education, because part of the appeal of Oda Benge in the Central Park Zoo was the kind of entertainment appeal of seeing Africa, as part of the full picture of seeing Africa. But exhibiting Oda Benge was also thought to be educational. And it was educational in the sense that it was conveying the racist eugenicist views that were then dominant, as if this was real science that was on display. And I think that should give us some pause when we think about education and about what it is that we're actually trying to teach people and really think that they should learn, and just how stable and important and solid and objective and value neutral that science is actually supposed to be. Now, there is actually very little rigorous empirical evidence for the value of the education that occurs in zoos. And trying to do really rigorous research on educational outcomes in zoos, we first really have to be clear about what we really want zoo education to achieve. And the answer to that question is itself not very clear. I mean, one thing you might want people to learn who are in zoos is you might want them to know more about animals, to increase their knowledge of animals. Well, that's probably a good thing, but that in itself is not very actionable. You might think that what zoo education should do is actually change people's behavior in ways that lead them, for example, to understand the connections between habitat destruction, climate change, and the extinction crisis that is now underway. And although I don't really take seriously any of the research I've seen on zoo education, there actually are studies out there that indicate that people's knowledge about climate change actually declines as a result of zoo visits. But again, I don't take that research any more seriously than I take the research that suggests that some positive educational effects happen. What I think this really does point out, though, is that talking about zoos as educational institutions is really sort of a rhetorical reach. It's not really something that there's much evidence for, and it's not really something that people do very much research on. And in any case, it's obvious, more obvious every day, that we are increasingly living in a world in which all experiential services, including education, including even university education, is increasingly being transformed by artificial intelligence and robotics. And the idea that gawking at living animals in zoo exhibits for a few seconds or minutes is really the best way of educating people about animals in nature just gets increasingly difficult to believe as the world becomes ever more virtual and digital. Now, research. The subject of zoo research is also itself a fraught topic, since it's generally more alluded to than practiced. But a lot of research that goes on in zoos is actually related to how to keep animals alive and relatively happy while being held in captivity in zoos. So of the research that actually happens in zoos, much of it is really devoted to helping to maintain the system of zoos in the first place, rather than providing research results that are going to be independently useful. So it's increasingly then conservation that is the central justification for this whole system of zoos and aquaria. Conservation is what is most often appealed to by scientists in the zoo community. But there are variations on this theme. So some people want to use zoos as the basis for captive breeding and reintroduction. Others want to use the economic and political resources of zoos in order to protect habitat. And still others would be satisfied if zoos could be constituted as genetic libraries for animals who no longer exist in viable populations. And sometimes it just seems that conservation is so highly valued that any activity that's done in the name of conservation is supposed to be considered a justification for zoos. Okay, now while you can argue about how great the contribution is and whether zoos could and should do more in this area, I think what's striking here is how strongly this function diverges from what zoos actually do most of the time and with most of their resources. Despite the rhetoric, most zoos really have no habitat conservation programs, and among those that do, it's rare when more than 1% to 2% of the budget is spent on them. I'm going to have to move very quickly through some stuff now, but zoo reintroductions have been a mixed success at best. And whatever the role of captive breeding and reintroduction in species preservation is, it also raises an inconsistency when it's enlisted as a justification for zoos. Zoos are places where people come to see animals. This is why people go to zoos. They're places to take children on Sunday afternoons. They're urban amenities, increasingly the sites of rock concerts and political fundraisers. But the best institutions for captive breeding and reintroduction would not play those roles. They would actually remove animals from excessive contact with people, give them relatively large ranges, and prepare them for reintroduction in ways that many zoo visitors might find shocking, for example, by helping to develop their competencies as predators. So what the importance of captive breeding and reintroduction justifies, if anything, is not really the existing systems of zoos, but a different kind of institution entirely, one that protects animals from people rather than putting animals on display. So whatever the power of the appeal to conservation, then the present zoo system seems to be unjustified. Now, how much time do I have left?
You can finish your.
Okay, I'm going to cut some stuff off. But what I want to say is, so these are the arguments for zoos, and they have some weight, and how much weight you think they have is going to sort of depend on individual assessments. But what I do want to say is that that these benefits that zoos may deliver have got to be balanced to the costs that zoos impose on animals. And some of these costs, which I think we'll be hearing about later, are welfare costs. They have to do with the welfare of animals that are kept in captivity. But there is another interest that's at stake, which in earlier writing I've called the animal's interest in liberty. And by liberty, I don't mean anything very fancy. I don't mean the freedom to vote or to take the subway to Hoboken to go to a rock concert. I simply mean the liberty that animals have to find their own food, to seek to procreate in ways that they desire, to essentially patrol the habitat in which they find themselves, and just those simple actions that are as much of the everyday life of non-human animals as they are of humans. Okay, so when in the end we balance the system of zoos, we need to balance these benefits, which insofar as they exist are mostly to humans, against the costs which I think apply mostly to animals, and people will balance these costs in different ways. Now, I'm going to skip over talking about individual zoos, and I'm going to skip over talking about individual exhibits. And I'm just going to go to the conclusion, which tries to answer the question that we were all asked here. And the fact is, I think, that zoos are not headed for extinction, at least anytime soon. Attendance at zoos is stable or even increasing at a time when some other cultural institutions are in trouble. In fact, if symphony orchestras could figure out what to do that zoos are doing, they would be in much better shape than they in fact are. But I do think that it will probably become increasingly uncomfortable for many people to think about zoos holding animals in captivity and managing them in the way that they do. There is a profound problem of why we have this system in place in the first place, and I think that problem will continue to haunt us. And I think we should continue to question the existence of this system of zoos. But first and foremost, we should do what we can to guarantee the welfare of these animals in their present conditions, as long as we continue to hold them for our own pleasure. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dale. You guys can hear me? That was a great segue, actually. And thank you to the committee for having me. My history does not go back quite as far as Dale's with the committee, but I'm a student member of the committee about almost 15 years ago, and it was an invaluable experience. I think every job, every internship I've had since is somehow related to that. So it's a wonderful committee. I'm really glad to be back today. So my focus is going to be on what are our laws doing to protect the welfare of animals at zoos. And Alexis mentioned there are two main statutes that come into play here, the Animal Welfare Act and the Endangered Species Act. I'm really going to focus exclusively on the Animal Welfare Act today because it's the overarching regulatory scheme for zoos. So the Endangered Species Act comes into play occasionally, particularly if the zoo wants to import or export a protected species from another country. But it's quite rare that it comes up, and it would be a whole different discussion. So if there are questions about it in the discussion, happy to talk about it further. But I'm going to focus on the Animal Welfare Act. And this is an act that I have litigated around, done regulatory work around for many years, and now my scholarship at Harvard is focused pretty much exclusively on the Animal Welfare Act and the implementation and enforcement problems. And a lot of my talk is going to draw on two forthcoming law review articles, and they're referenced on the list of recommended readings that's by the door, and they're available online if you want to dig into these issues more. So I'm first going to give you a very basic overview of the Animal Welfare Act and how it regulates, or is supposed to regulate, animals in zoos. And then I'm going to talk about some of the key enforcement problems with the Act, and then I'll transition and end on a discussion of licensing practices that really compound the enforcement problems with the statute. So I hope that at the end of my presentation, I will have convinced you that regardless of where you stand on zoos, they are not being adequately regulated in the United States today. So the Animal Welfare Act, like I said, is the main and really the only statute regulating zoos. And it's enforced by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or it's supposed to be enforced by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it operates through a licensing and inspection regime. So if you want to exhibit animals as a zoo, you need to get a license from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and once you're licensed, you're subject to routine inspections for compliance with minimum animal welfare standards. So what do these standards govern? They're really basic. Like I said, they're minimum. They're also generic. So for the vast majority of animals, including everything from bats to elephants to tigers to bears to zebras, they're covered by the same generic standards that say, for example, you need to provide adequate space, you need to provide adequate veterinary care. So it doesn't provide a lot of guidance to the inspector or to the regulated community. And I've seen instances, a bear in a concrete pit actually who was pacing back and forth, which is recognized to be a sign of inadequate space, where the inspector wrote on the report, I don't think this bear has enough space, but the standards are so vague, I don't feel like I can cite them. So that's the kind of standards that we're talking about. In addition, you have about 100 inspectors. Last official count that I know of was in November, 104 inspectors who are tasked with inspecting more than 15,000 locations, not just zoos, but research facilities, wholesale pet breeders and dealers, and more than 1 million animals all told. So it's quite difficult for these inspectors to do their job between the resources, the number of inspectors, and the standards that they're forced to deal with. The statute does not require any frequency of inspection for zoos, so You may be inspected frequently if you're a chronic violator. If you're not a chronic violator, you may only be inspected every 3 years, according to the Department of Agriculture. Inspections were, until recently, all available on a publicly searchable database. And I'm not going to get into it too much today, but the USDA recently blacked out its website and took down all of its inspection reports for the Animal Welfare Act, enforcement actions, and I'm a party in a lawsuit challenging that. There's actually an article on NBC just today that came out about it, so again, happy to discuss during the Q&A, but I want to focus on the enforcement issues today. So they go out, they do an inspection, they find violations. What happens? Usually nothing. In the vast majority of cases, nothing. If something does happen, it's usually a warning, an official warning. So this is the enforcement actions for fiscal year 2015. It's a pretty typical year. More than 70% of the cases in which the agency thought the situation was bad enough to do something, they just issued a warning. And what do I mean by a warning? Here's an example, and all of the examples I'm using today are from AZA accredited zoos. So this is from the Dickerson Park Zoo, and it basically says, we think you violated the law. It's in small print at the bottom, basically, don't do it again or else we might take more serious enforcement action. So this was an incident in which a giraffe had to be euthanized after inappropriate handling during unloading caused spinal cord and neck vertebrae damage. Just to give you a couple other examples of warnings, you all probably remember the Staten Island Zoo groundhog incident, in which the zoo allowed Mayor de Blasio to handle a groundhog, even though he had understandably no training in handling these animals. The animal escaped and fell. They then took that same groundhog to a school to be exhibited. Less than a week later, the animal fell again and was found dead a couple days later. So that was handled by the USDA through a warning. Zoo Miami received a warning after failing to provide adequate veterinary care to 2 antelope calves who died from nematode infections. So they weren't getting care to prevent that. And these were incidents that happened about 6 months apart. It wasn't calves from the same time period. And the second calf also received no veterinary care for 2.5 weeks after beginning to exhibit illness. That was handled through a warning. So one of my research projects, I examine how much are warnings actually motivating compliance. If this is the primary way we're enforcing the Animal Welfare Act, is it working? And what I found, examining recidivism by those facilities that receive warnings after they received warnings, was that almost 40% went on to be cited for 6 or more violations. More than 40% were cited for 1 or more repeat violation. That means you violate the exact same standard that was documented on the prior inspection report. And perhaps most concerning, more than 25% were cited for 1 or more direct violations. And those are violations that are the most likely to impact the well-being of the animal. They're considered the most serious type of welfare violation. So to give you an example, Dale teed this up nicely. The Los Angeles Zoo has a long history of a lot of problems, and a lot of them involve animal escapes or other animals getting into animal enclosures, but they particularly have a chronic problem with primate handling, primate escapes, primates being attacked. Just a few examples over the years, a volunteer was mauled by a primate, suffered lacerations, puncture wounds, deep cuts, was permanently disabled and disfigured. An orangutan bit a keeper, numerous chimpanzees, and chimpanzees have escaped. 3 chimpanzees all escaped together 3 separate times. Multiple gorilla escapes. So clearly a problem with their primate enclosures. After an orang escaped in 2012, they were given one of these official warnings, for the escape. It was cited as a direct violation because the orang was, put at risk, and they were given a warning. Amongst other things, even when you're cited, if you don't, whether you get a warning or not, you're told you need to come into compliance within X amount of time. When the USDA inspected in March 2014, so more than a year later, they saw that the zoo had not, in fact, fixed its primate enclosures. And what did they do at that point? They issued what's called a letter of information, which is actually less than a warning. It's more or less like a warning, but it's not made public. So it's a private letter sent saying, hey, you're violating the law, don't do that. Clearly, it's not a very credible threat, and not surprisingly, the LA Zoo has continued to have problems. So in May of 2015, 2 langurs escaped after a keeper left multiple doors unsecured. In July of 2015, 2 cotton-topped tamarins went missing from an enclosure that had access points for other animals to get in. The remains of one of the tamarins was found. The other one was never recovered. Footage showed a bobcat carrying one of the tamarins away. So the bottom line is there's not really meaningful enforcement. And what I looked at, what happens to people who ignore these warnings? Because that's really what it's going to come down to. Is the warning meaningful? Is it, as I said, a credible threat? And what I found is that those who continue to recidivate even after receiving a warning, usually nothing happens to them at all. You can see that's by far the largest category. Then the next most likely thing is that you'll get another warning, similar to what happened with the LA Zoo. Obviously not that credible. And then the others are more serious, either a settlement or a formal administrative complaint initiating a formal hearing process. The problem with the settlements is that they're severely discounted. So the Animal Welfare Act provides for up to $10,000 a day per violation per animal. So that can add up pretty quickly. But what I found is that when the folks who continued violating even after receiving a warning did enter into a settlement, on average they paid just 4 cents on the dollar for a potential penalty that they faced. And that this issue of discounted penalties is a long-standing issue with the Animal Welfare Act. So even in the rare cases where they take more meaningful enforcement, the USDA's own Office of Inspector General.
Ron's feedback.
That? Oh, that's better.
It's frozen too. Yeah, the screen's frozen as well.
Well,
Pausing the time.
They told me this was a direct feed on the video.
Should I keep going?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so the USDA's own Office of Inspector General has found repeatedly that because the agency is discounting penalties so much, they're failing to deter